Luke chapter 20, be reading from verses 19 to chapter 21, verse 4. Hear the word of the Lord. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and the jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children, and the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterward, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had her as wife." And Jesus said to them, "The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die anymore, because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him." Then some of the scribes answered, "Teacher, you have spoken well." For they no longer dared to ask him any questions. But he said to them, "How can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' David thus calls him Lord. So how is he his son?" And in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feast, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting in their gifts into the offering box, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on." May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, I think I have an unhealthy craving for controversy. It's a weakness, and Paul warns against that in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 4. And so I try most of the time to suppress that. If face to face, I'll bite my tongue and walk away sometimes. Once we had a controversy right here in gym, the youth meeting on Sunday evenings, when 2 girls got into a fight, a vicious brawl. I tried to break it up. I was the main one to break it up after getting punched in the nose myself and getting one of the girls outside and then preventing her from going back in to rejoin the fight. I didn't enjoy that controversy at all. I have no craving at all for that kind of controversy. And about a half hour later, myself still kind of hyped up on adrenaline, her parents came back, having been lied to that I put her, quote, in a chokehold, which never happened, and wanted to confront me about it. And I knew that was a horrible idea. That is, to me, to talk to those parents. That would almost certainly end in an ugly argument. So I just refused to talk to them and let others handle it. Some controversies I just want nothing to deal with. But I have a weakness for controversies of ideas. And now with social media, it's easy. Just a quick search, I can always find something who says something wrong that I can argue with. So convenient now to argue. Many people have commented how the atmosphere on some social media is just toxic, particularly Twitter, I think, with people always looking for arguments, for controversy. Trolls, they're called, just people out there looking to argue. You can always find someone online who is willing to argue about anything, whatever it is, take your pick. Many people seem to think that social media has created these kind of people, as if before they were all peaceful, harmony-loving, good neighbors. But I don't believe that. I believe that they, or maybe we, were always like that. That before, we just didn't have the outlet. You'd have to write letters to the editor, denounce something, or maybe yell at somebody on TV. You're so dumb, whoever you are. Or for that rare moment of, look for a rare moment of actual face-to-face disagreements. That was, of course, also cumbersome. Letters to the editor don't give you immediate feedback. Yelling at the TV gives you no feedback at all. And most of us, if we see an actual person talking to them, we see the person and not just the bad, what we think of as the bad ideas that they happen to be saying. But now, we controversy addicts can get our controversy fix on our phones. That's not good. That's not good at all. That's like getting drunk, not good. It's that kind of not good. And Paul condemns it as unhealthy and specifically says that pastors should not be quarrelsome. That is someone who just quarrels for no reason. Just goes out of his way just to kind of argue for their entertainment, for the love of arguing, of quarreling. So I have to watch myself, restrain myself, to tell myself not to comment some things, or to tone it down when I do. I don't always succeed. How do you think Jesus would be on social media? What would his Twitter feed be like? Or his Facebook post? Would he be just above all that, just too busy to engage with people face-to-face, teaching, healing, delivering, and praying, that he wouldn't spend any time with that? Or would he use it kind of like John Piper does as a venue to get the word out, but never really interacting with particular people? Or would he respond to people, to critics? Would he deal in controversy? Can you see him posting something about these hypocrites, these Pharisees are hypocrites? Would you do that? Deal in controversy, disagree, correct, rebuke? Or is social media just not a good tool for that? Generally, though, putting aside social media, how does Jesus handle controversy? Well, we see that here in 4 parts. First, hear, H-E-R-E, the place, not the command to listen. Second, heaven. Third, himself. And fourth, the heart. So here, heaven, himself, heart. First, here, as in, how do we live here on earth? How responsible are we to the world here? The systems, the politics, the governments, the society. Are we just so much citizens of heaven that we don't have anything to do with the demands of the here and now? It's all above all that stuff. It's just so carnal. We don't have to worry about it. Well, here the scribes and the chief priests are out to get Jesus, especially after that last parable, the parable of the wicked tenants. Unlike some of his parables in which the average person was going like, huh? I don't understand what he's talking about. This time, they all knew. They all knew exactly what he was saying. It was about them. It was about how they're like the wicked tenants of a vineyard who beat the servants, the prophets, and murdered the beloved son, and so will have the vineyard, the kingdom of God, taken away from them. That was so controversial. Talk about dealing, not being afraid of controversy. That was controversial. So controversial that even many of the people hanging on his every word cried out. Even his fans were saying, whoa, may it never be. So the religious leaders wanted to get him after that, get him all the more, but the people were still for him. They might think he's kind of controversial, that Jesus guy. He's edgy. But, as long as he's not hitting them too directly, they probably didn't mind. Especially by that last parable. They were still eating up his teachings. And so in verse 20, the religious leaders watched Jesus and sent spies, kind of undercover agents, acting like they're sincere to try to trap him in some controversy, to get him to take a stand on some controversial topic in which he'll alienate a large group of people. Our politicians try this all the time against their opponents. Are you for defunding the police? Or are you for racism? Are you for court packing? Or are you for systemic injustice? Are you for amnesty for illegal immigrants? Or are you xenophobic? Try to put you in one of those categories. It's a tactic to try to get the target to say something, take a stand that's controversial, so controversial that it will alienate many people from him or her. Here the religious leaders were trying to turn the crowds away from Jesus so that they could then send in their guards to arrest him. They already tried that by asking him about his authority, but they struck out. Next at bat are the scribes. It's kind of the devout religious scholars, leaders. In verse 20, they were going to pretend to be sincere. They were acting like they really respected Jesus, that they supported him, that they really just wanted to know his beliefs. That's really all they were about. Of course, they were faking. Well, first they start with flattery in verse 21. Teacher, itself a term of respect. We know that you speak and teach rightly. Oh, that's a true statement, but they didn't really believe it. They don't really believe that. They assume, like most people did. Most people assume that other people are like them. And so be careful what people accuse others of. Sometimes that exposes what they're like. And here they're assuming that they're like them, that they love being flattered, they love being exalted, and so they're going to assume Jesus likes the same thing. He loves being buttered up and flattered, and so he will let his guard down if he thinks he's with supporters. And they said, with fake deference, you show no partiality. You don't care who you're talking to, even the powerful. You don't care who you're rebuking, but truly you teach the way of God. You don't care if you make Pontius Pilate mad. You say it like it is. And here they're trying to hint at him, to coax him toward the controversy they want, something that they can report to the Romans as seditious and get him crucified. Come on, Jesus. That's what they say. Come on, Jesus. Say the Romans are illegitimate. Come on, say it. We know you want to. Say they're illegitimate and we don't owe them anything. Say it. And try to speak clearly into this microphone I have here under my shirt. And so they ask him in verse 22, is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? They put it as a yes or no question, putting him on the horns of a dilemma. If he says, yeah, it's lawful, according to God's law, you can do it, you should do it. Well, many in the crowd, the zealots, the kind of the hot-headed patriots, will say, well, he's a collaborator. He's a spineless, quizzling captive to the power of Rome. If he says, no, it's not lawful, it's against God's law, well, then they'll make a beeline for Pontius Pilate, who will send in the Roman soldiers to grab him. So they think they have him here. There's no way out. How does Jesus handle controversy? Many think, well, he'll just avoid it. He avoids all controversy. That he's always above the fray, above controversy, unwilling to get pinned down to the practical issues here and now. That he deals in platitudes, sweet, general, kind of impractical statements, nice-sounding phrases like peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Who doesn't love that? You might find it on a Christmas card. But he doesn't come down clearly on any particular issue. He doesn't take a stand. He's above it all. In the late 80s and early 90s, there was a movement against abortion called Operation Rescue that organized people to physically block the entrance to abortion clinics. The pro-life protesters would either sit down or maybe lock arms in front of the clinics, or abortion mills, as some call them. I'm not sure you should call them clinics. When about 50% of your patients come out dead, that's not really a clinic, I don't think. But anyway, the object was to prevent them from entering them. Then the police would have to come and drag them off and arrest them. Police, that's their job, to enforce the law. And I remember watching that news coverage of this in seminary on TV, on Mary's TV, near Los Angeles, and just wondering what it would be like if you were a Christian policeman. I understand it's your job to enforce the law. And just turning over this ethical issue in my head, not really looking for controversy, and ask a fellow student who's watching with me on Mary's TV, do you think a Christian policeman could do that, could arrest legitimately peaceful protesters blocking the entrance to these clinics? And he got agitated, nearly angry, and said, don't ask me questions like that. There's a kind of spirituality, this otherworldly, that just doesn't want to be involved with the actual real life affairs of this world. Doesn't want to deal with real issues that people face here and now. Don't take a stand on any particular thing. It's all just below us, I guess, is the mentality. At least the real spiritual us. We're above all that. We shouldn't be bothered by it. Now, of course, if we have to go along with what the world says to do, well, we'll go along. Our bodies will go along and do our duties, but our heart is above it all, I guess, is the attitude. If the government says to round up Jews and send them to camps, well, we'll do what we're told, and then we'll go to church and sing Silent Night, assured that we're justified, untouched by the contamination of the controversies of this world. That's not Jesus' way. Here, Jesus does, in fact, answer the question. He answers it actually quite clearly. But first, he had to deal with the real issue, which was their craftiness, their heart. They weren't asking a sincere question. Oh, the question is legitimate, but they weren't asking it for legitimate reasons. They're asking it to catch him. People are often like that today. They may use questions in debates, but they're often not really interested in whether God exists or Jesus really walked the earth. They're interested in furthering their agenda, whatever it is, their cause, maybe just to discredit the faith. You can answer all their questions intellectually, but if you don't get to that basic issue, you're nearly not going to convince them. They'll just go on to another question. And so Jesus tells them in verse 24, show me a denarius. And someone pulls out one. And Jesus asks, whose likeness and inscription does it have? Caesar's. So it's his money, isn't it? He minted it. You're dealing with his realm, so you owe him. So in verse 25, here's the conclusion, the principle. Therefore, because of that, because it's Caesar's money, render or give to Caesar, that is the government, what is Caesar's. Render to Washington what is Washington's. To the state, the government, the nation here in which you live, what is the government's. Jesus practically answers their question. He comes down on a definite side of this controversy. Yes, your taxes are due. If you're dealing with the world's money, you owe the world's taxes. You live here in this world, in particular countries, under particular governments. You must be a reliable citizen here and not use your spirituality as an excuse to pretend like you're not living here. Kent Hovind was a kind of self-proclaimed evangelist, I get to put that in quotation marks, who got various unaccredited degrees, really fake degrees, and in the 80s and 90s became somewhat prominent as Dr. Dino, would be his nickname, for his teaching on dinosaurs, although his fake education had nothing to do with archaeology or dinosaurs, but never mind that. Including, though, he opened a theme park called Dinosaur Adventureland near Pensacola, Florida. He started businesses to sell his teachings and products with business licenses issued by, he said, the Kingdom of Heaven, not the state of Florida. He was associated with a group called the Unregistered Baptist Fellowship, UBF, that is committed to, quote, a theology of Christian resistance to civil governments. They claimed that the government's authority stops, quote, at the threshold of the church. I guess right up there. We have the door propped open, but it's still, I guess it stops out there. And so they wouldn't file to become a 501c3 nonprofit corporation or abide by state and federal laws or pay taxes. It turns out, believe it or not, that the government did not agree. In 2006, it convicted Hovind of 58 felonies and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. All of that because he thinks he's not really living here. Oh, his body may be here, but he's not under the governments that we have here. What do we owe the government? Well, here we see from Jesus that we do owe it something. We owe it taxes. Taxation is not theft, as some American conservatives like to say, contrary to that. Some American Christians are more shaped by their anti-government politics than they are by the Bible. They'll talk and write as if the government has no right really to tell them to do anything. You know, wearing a mask is tyranny, they scream. But the government here, we see, does have authority, and we owe it submission insofar as it doesn't command us to do what God says not to do, or prevents us from doing what God says to do. Understand? And in America now, it's more complicated. In other democracies, it's more complicated because we can all have some say in the government by voting, and so we should all vote. And because the ultimate authority here is supposed to be the Constitution, not the actual office holders. And the Constitution tells us, for example, that Congress, which is now interpreted to mean all governments in the U.S., state, local, shall not prohibit the free exercise of religion. Now, here's the question. Is issuing they like to call it now, a mandate, it's really an edict. It sounds less oppressive to call it a mandate. If they issue an edict that we can't meet, or that we can only have at most 10 people in a building, even a building this size at one time, is that prohibiting the free exercise of religion that we're supposed to be guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution? Well, if it's just 15 days to slow the spread, just really 2 services that were restricted, or a small number, well, maybe not. Maybe it's not really restricting us. And we want to be good neighbors. We want to be good citizens. But if it's 9 months and counting, if it's just indefinite, if it's just, they say, until we say otherwise, that's obviously prohibiting the free exercise of religion. And it's beyond what Caesar, what our government, by its own definition, has the authority to do. So we don't have to render that to Caesar. Now, ideally in our system, the Supreme Court would recognize that in a case like that, where we're just shut down indefinitely until they say the storm is blown over, would recognize that the government has overstepped, that it's asking us to render something to it that doesn't belong to it, and the Supreme Court would step in and just say, no, you can't do that. And thankfully, they did just that the day before Thanksgiving, saying that the state of New York did not have the right to restrict churches and synagogues. That's something to be thankful for, the day before Thanksgiving. But the scary thing is, it was only 5-4 in the Supreme Court. It barely passed. Seems to be the most obvious thing, but it barely passed. And it only passed because of the new judge who had been appointed just last October. If then we didn't have a new judge and the Supreme Court then upheld the restrictions, and so we could go for who knows how long, having what is supposed to be a constitutional right to the free exercise of religion just taken away until they say otherwise. If we are prohibited from meeting indefinitely, do we submit? No, we do not. That doesn't belong to Caesar. It doesn't belong to Caesar biblically, from what Jesus says. It doesn't belong constitutionally, and what Caesar in the Constitution says is the role of the government. Now, if the money bears the government's image, the government can tell us what to do with it. But when it comes to what bears God's image, that belongs to God. Now, what bears God's image? People do. We do. We render ourselves to God. And if Caesar says, no, you can't, well, we quietly smile and we do it anyway. Right here. Believers in China have been having to deal with this really for a long time. They have official churches. They call them the three self churches, which the government approves of and controls. But many believers there believe that the government does not have the right to tell them how to worship and who should be their pastors and so on and control their churches. And so they'll meet in unregistered, technically illegal churches. If we have to meet illegally, then we'll do it, because we're rendering to God what is God's: worship, our hearts, our lives. Here, Jesus both answered the immediate question about taxes, yes, you have to pay them, and the real issue that these men here tried to trap him, their real issue, their real problem. Render to God the things that are God's. That's what they haven't been doing. That's why they are trying to trap him. With that, he answers their thorny question and he shuts them up. He put it so perfectly, there's just nothing they could accuse him of. You'd think then, after that perfect answer, that would change their hearts and they believe in him. But hostile people aren't really won by reason and then change their hearts. Their hearts have to be changed before they'll be open to reason. Well, that's strike two. Next comes the Sadducees. They're kind of the aristocrats. They're the priests. They don't believe in the resurrection. They thought they're smarter than everyone else. They're not coming to try to trap him. It doesn't look like they're trying to trap him like the Pharisees were. They're just coming to try to show what they think is how stupid he was. Just like all those other bumpkins who believe that there's a resurrection, what we might call heaven. They thought that they have just the scenario to show how ridiculous this idea of a resurrection is. And so they come up to him, probably with a smirk on their face, and tell this long story about how a woman had 7 husbands, and they were all brothers. None of them, no children. And so whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Probably snickering in the background. We got him on this one. And Jesus answers, you're just assuming that the age to come is like this age. A lot of Christians today assume the same thing. They assume that heaven, we often call it, will be a big family reunion. We'll get to meet all our deceased relatives there. And we'll all get to be about 30-something eternally. That's nice and convenient. And our kids will be running around. I guess they'll be eternally kids, which maybe they won't like that. I don't. You ever thought of that? Maybe our kids don't want to be our kids forever. And our elderly parents will be there with us, perpetually elderly. Maybe they don't want to be old for eternity either, I guess. Everything, of course, revolving around us. Of course, when you put it like that, that doesn't make much sense, does it? That's why the Bible doesn't put it like that. It doesn't really teach much. The Bible doesn't, for a faith that critics often say, you're otherworldly, heavenly minded about sugar candy mountain high truths about heaven that are over the rainbow. The Bible really doesn't say a whole lot about what, quote, heaven will be like. Partly here, Jesus does. It doesn't teach us much about what it will be like in that age, what Jesus calls it here in verse 35. This is Jesus' language. He talks about that age, the resurrection. A myth of our culture is that some of the dead are like ghosts, like the ghost of Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol. They're kind of only a shadow of who they were. Transparent spirits, some grim looking, some like walking corpses. Or for others, heaven is spirits kind of floating on a cloud. But the Bible says that eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9. In other words, it's greater than we can dream. And it is a resurrection. And so it's physical. Here are the Sadducees, smart alecks. They assume, kind of like the Mormons today. The Mormons believe the same thing. Who believe that believers will be eternally married and eternally begetting children. That's what heaven is like. The Sadducees the same way, that heaven, the resurrection, is just like this life. And so Jesus just explodes that assumption. Dealing with controversy, he gets beneath the assumptions of the people he's in controversy with. He says that those who are considered worthy by who? Another passive voice. Well, by God. Those whom God considers worthy to be resurrected, they are not married. Marriage in the family is a temporary institution for this life, for this age. They aren't married in verse 36. He says, because they cannot die. They don't need to raise children to keep the race going. They are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. So in other words, he's saying to the Sadducees, your whole assumption about the nature of the afterlife is wrong. You just assumed it. You didn't think through. For proof of the resurrection, proof that people don't just die and are no more, that there's no life after physical life, Jesus points to one of the most important passages of the Old Testament. These people thought they were smart. And he didn't go to some obscure quote somewhere in Leviticus where hardly anyone reads. He went to one of the most prominent passages in the entire Old Testament. The passage of Moses at the burning bush, where the Lord says he's the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. If Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died and just kind of disappeared as worm food, God would not say that he is, present tense, their God. Jesus says he's not the God of the dead, but of the living. For all live to him. They still exist in the presence of God. Strike three. The Sadducees had probably been stumping the Pharisees with that riddle for years. They thought it was so clever. And now Jesus has just blown it up. And so even some of them are just amazed. They exclaim, teacher. Some of the scribes, the Pharisees, teacher. Wow, we never knew what to do with that question. Teacher, you have spoken well. And so no one dared ask him any more questions. But Jesus isn't done yet. It's a question he wants to be asked It appears like he wishes someone would ask it. And so he asked it himself. And it's about himself. How can, he asked, how can the teachers, the scribes, say that the Christ, the anointed one, is David's son? How can they say that? Now, Jesus is not really rejecting the idea that the Messiah, as himself, is the son of David. You know, the blind man on the way into Jericho in chapter 18 called him that, son of David, have mercy on me, and he responded to it. This is kind of like the rich young ruler calling, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? Why do you call me good? Jesus wasn't denying that he's good. Here he's not denying that the Messiah is the son of David, that he's the son of David. What he means is getting people, again, to think through. What does this mean? What's behind this? What he means is how can the Messiah be just David's son, merely another physical descendant, any other man coming from the line of David? And then he quotes from Psalm 110, which is attributed to David. The Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord. If you're reading in English, it's the Lord, and it's all capital letters, which means represents Yahweh, says to my Lord, and then it's capital L, but it's in small O-R-D, my master. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Now, in that verse, God is speaking to the Messiah, but David calls the Messiah, otherwise known as the son of David, he calls him Lord, Adonai, master. Now, who calls his own son master? Who does that? Now, I remember as a kid visiting my grandmother when she told my father, mind you, to take out the trash. I was just stunned as a little kid. I was thinking in my little head, no one tells Daddy what to do. Well, his mother does. Now, what would have really been strange, of course, is if his mother, my grandmother, called him sir and served him hand and foot. Who calls their own son sir? Nobody that I know of. Who calls their own son master? Unless the son, of course, is more than a son. A son, yes, but more than a son. More than a baby born in Bethlehem on Christmas, away in a manger. Unless he's God. That's how Jesus is dealing with controversy. He's trying to get them to think about these things. He's planting seeds. That's about himself. Finally, Jesus has to deal with the heart for hypocrites. What is in their heart? We talked about them earlier this year. Remember the infection of hypocrisy? Well, here he's telling his disciples, that's us, hopefully, to beware of being infected with their hypocrisy. And look for the symptoms here. They like special clothes. They like the holy clothes, here, the holy robes. They like greetings. They like titles, a reverend, bishop, apostle. They like to be pointed out in public as someone special in the marketplaces or at feast, having special seats or parking places. What's in their heart? A greed for recognition, to be somebody. They're also just plain greedy, promising you God's blessings if you give to them, and not caring, if poor widows believe these promises and then give them everything they have, and then they don't have anything. They're showy. They'll pray long, flowery prayers, maybe emotional, heavy breathing prayers. Oh God. So you know how zealous they are. Or maybe like informal, sweet, kind of intimate, starting and ending every sentence with Father God, Father God. So you know how close to God they are. Now, if they're new believers, okay, I understand. Maybe they're new. They can be sincere. They mean well. But for others, sometimes all that is just a pretense. It's a show. And Jesus says they will receive the greater condemnation, greater than all the sinners they look down on, because of what's in their heart, their greed. Now, in contrast to them is a sincere, poor old lady, unnamed, that Jesus sees in the temple. Jesus here teaching, sees her there, points her out. They had an offering box set up in the temple in which everyone could see your giving. You could see how much you're putting in there. Now, the only way to get hypocrites to give, because they love money, the only way to get hypocrites to give is either you got to convince them that it's the law from God, you've got to give, or you're robbing God, It's the law. You got to give your set percentage. And so if you teach them that, they will give that set percentage right to the penny and no more, because they don't really want to give. They just want to keep the law. Or you have them give in public so they can show it off. Look how much I'm giving everybody. Like today, when someone or some organization gives a big gift to a charity, and they do it with one of these huge checks. I don't know where you get these things from, but somebody makes them, I guess. It's about 6 foot long, and there'll be like 2 or 3 people holding this one check. And they make sure, of course, to take a picture. That's what some of the rich folks here were doing. But then came along a poor widow. Probably no one else noticed her except Jesus. She's not giving much. No one makes 6 foot long checks to give 2 cents. Here in chapter 24, verse 1, she gave 2 small copper coins. That's the smallest amount of money they had, these coins, the smallest worth coins they had around. Who cares? She's giving 2 small copper coins. Who cares? Jesus does. He sees that. He points it out. Look at that lady. She gave those 2 coins. Says, truly, you can take it to the bank. I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others, more than the millionaire with a 6 foot long check and the photographer, because those rich people with their 6 foot long checks and photographers, contributed out of their abundance, out of their excess of what money they had left over after they spent it on nice clothes and cars and everything else, big TVs. And they had a bunch left over, and so they thought, what do I do with this money? I know what. I'll buy respect by giving it publicly in the temple. This lady didn't think that, did she? No one is going to respect her for her 2 small copper coins. She'd have to go without something because it's all she had. So she'd have to give up something. Maybe bread, maybe oil, maybe cable TV, because she gave to support the worship of God. She did it because she had a heart for God. She wasn't a hypocrite. Where does Jesus stand in controversies? Well, he stands against the hypocrites, exposing the greed in their hearts. He stands for those with sincere hearts, whose sincerity means that they give more because they've given their hearts to God. He stands for living right here in this age, responsibly under governments, but giving our lives to God, rendering to God what is God's, presenting ourselves as living sacrifices here in our work, in our families, in our social media, looking forward to that age, that resurrection, which is better than anything we can imagine. He stands for himself because he is God. He's not just a son, not just a man, not just a baby born in a manger. He is called Lord. Even by kings, he is called Lord. He expects us to stand for him too. Do you?